Right now, somewhere in the world, a set of parents is negotiating the terms of their daughter's marriage with another family, discussing land, livestock, and obligations, and neither the bride nor the groom has said a single word in the meeting. Most people watching this today feel a jolt of discomfort at that image. Where is her choice? Where is love? For almost the entire span of human existence, that discomfort would have made no sense to anyone. Choosing your own spouse based on how your chest feels around them is one of the strangest, newest ideas our species has ever tried, and for most of the last 300,000 years, nobody was doing it. So who was choosing, and why did it work well enough to keep an entire species reproducing successfully for hundreds of millennia? The answer involves a French anthropologist who mapped marriage like an exchange system, a Finnish philosopher who figured out why you're not attracted to your siblings, an Israeli sociologist who accidentally tested that theory on thousands of children, a Taiwanese case study of children raised as future spouses, and a mating system that had almost nothing to do with romance and almost everything to do with keeping small groups of humans alive in a world that wanted them dead. If ancient behavior that still lives inside your own instincts is the kind of thing you want more of, subscribe, because this channel goes looking for exactly that. Start with the assumption most people bring into this topic, which is that ancient marriage must have been simple and instinctive, something close to animals pairing off. Actual anthropological data destroys that assumption almost immediately. In 1949, French anthropologist Claude Levi-Strauss published a study that reframed marriage entirely, arguing that in prehistoric and traditional societies, marriage functioned as a system of exchange between groups rather than a bond between two individuals. Women were not simply choosing husbands, they were the currency of alliance building, the mechanism through which one clan created a lasting binding relationship with another clan. A marriage was a treaty with a wedding attached. Levi-Strauss called this the exchange of women, and the underlying logic was cold and practical. Two small, isolated groups of humans who might otherwise raid each other for resources became family instead, obligated to share food during famine, warn each other of danger, and fight on the same side during conflict. Marriage was diplomacy, and diplomacy was survival. Decades earlier, Polish anthropologist Bronislaw Malinowski had documented a living version of exactly this system among the Trobriand Islanders of Papua New Guinea. Malinowski spent years embedded in Trobriand villages in the 1910s, and he watched marriage operate inside a much larger web of ritual exchange called the Kula ring, in which families traded shell ornaments, yams, and obligations across island chains that stretched for hundreds of miles. A marriage there was never an isolated event between two people. It slotted into an entire economy of gifts, debts, and favors that bound villages together across open ocean. And a family that refused a proposed match wasn't just rejecting a son-in-law, they were refusing an entire network of future support. Anthropologist Frank Marlowe, who spent years living among the Hadza of Tanzania, compiled data from 100 Ainti hunter-gatherer societies in 2003 and found that marriage among foragers was rarely a private decision made by the two people involved. Parents, uncles, and senior kin negotiated matches, often when the future spouses were still children or teenagers. Roughly 85% of the societies in Marlowe's dataset practiced some form of bride service or bride price, meaning a groom, or his family, had to pay the bride's family in labor, meat, or goods before the marriage counted as valid. Among the Ake of Paraguay, studied extensively by Kim Hill and Magdalena Hurtado through the 1980s and 1990s, a young man might spend years hunting for his in-laws before he was permitted to take his wife to live with him. Love, when it showed up, tended to grow after the arrangement was made rather than before it. Hill and Hurtado also documented something among the Ache that sounds almost like science fiction to modern ears, a belief system anthropologists call partible paternity. Ache women during pregnancy would sometimes have multiple sexual partners, and the culture held that each of those men contributed some biological share to the resulting child. A single baby could grow up with 2 or 3 recognized fathers, each one expected to hunt for the mother and provide meat to the child, spreading the burden of provisioning across several men instead of one. Children with multiple acknowledged fathers in Hill and Hurtado's data actually survived childhood at higher rates than children with a single father because more men were invested in keeping them fed. Monogamy, it turns out, was never the only formula that worked. It was simply one option among several that different environments selected for. Anthropologist George Murdoch cataloged marriage systems across nearly 1,200 societies for his ethnographic atlas, published in 1967, and the results complicate the picture further. Around 85% of the societies in Murdoch's dataset permitted polygyny, meaning a man could have more than one wife. But permission and practice are different things. Even in societies where multiple wives were culturally allowed, most men still ended up with one wife or none, because supporting multiple households required resources that only a small number of wealthy or high-status men ever controlled. The result was a strange numbers problem playing out quietly underneath the surface of ancient social life. A minority of high-status men accumulated multiple wives, which meant a portion of lower-status men had no wife at all, which meant competition for the remaining unmarried women intensified, which fed directly back into why alliances, negotiations, and family control over matchmaking mattered so much in the first place. Marriage wasn't just about pairing people off. It was about managing an unequal distribution of mates in a way that kept the whole group from tearing itself apart with jealousy and conflict. Marriage itself, once arranged, was rarely treated as a private contract signed and filed away. French folklorist Arnold van Gennep, writing in 1909, described weddings as one of the clearest examples of what he called a rite of passage. A ceremony built around three stages: separation from an old social status, a middle stage where a person belongs to neither category, and incorporation into a new status recognized by the entire community. In society after society that anthropologists have documented, a wedding was staged publicly and elaborately precisely because the point was not the private feelings of the couple. The point was making sure every person in the group updated their mental map of who now owed obligations to whom, who was now off limits as a future partner, and which two families were now bound together. A quiet, private decision between two people would have failed at the actual job marriage was doing, because nobody else would have known the alliance existed. Genetics eventually caught up with what the ethnographers had been describing all along. In 2017, a team led by geneticist Eski Willerslev and archaeologist Martin Sikora analyzed the genomes of skeletons buried at Sunghir in Russia, a site roughly 34,000 years old containing some of the most elaborate Ice Age burials ever found, covered in thousands of carefully carved ivory beads. The researchers expected to find a small, isolated, inbred community, the kind you would assume from a tiny band of hunter-gatherers surviving an ice age together. Instead, they found the opposite. None of the individuals buried at Sunghir were closely related to each other, and the genetic patterns suggested the community had been deliberately seeking mates from outside their immediate group for generations, maintaining a breeding network stretched across many separate bands. Sikora's team concluded that Upper Paleolithic humans had already worked out, without writing, without formal science, and probably without ever consciously naming the problem, that a small isolated population marrying only within itself was a demographic dead end. The Sunghir burials suggest Ice Age humans were running something close to a continent-spanning marriage network tens of thousands of years before Levi-Strauss ever put a name to the exchange of women, moving partners across huge distances specifically to keep the gene pool wide enough to survive. The negotiations solved one problem. Biology solved another, and this is where the story turns genuinely strange. In 1891, Finnish philosopher and sociologist Edvard Westermarck proposed something that seemed almost too tidy to be true: that children raised in close physical proximity during early childhood, regardless of whether they are biologically related, develop an automatic, unconscious sexual aversion to each other as adults. He called it the theory of imprinted disgust. Anthropologists mocked it for most of a century, largely because it seemed impossible to test on living humans in a controlled way. Then, in 1971, Israeli sociologist Joseph Shepard accidentally ran the experiment for real. He studied thousands of young adults raised together on Israeli Kibbutzim, where unrelated children were placed into shared peer groups from birth, and raised almost like siblings, sharing rooms, meals, and daily routines for their entire childhoods. Shepard combed through marriage records looking for pairings between people who had grown up in the same peer group. Out of nearly 3,000 marriages he examined, he found 0 pairings between children raised together, even in cases with no rule against it, no religious prohibition, and no biological relationship standing in the way. A second confirmation came from Taiwan, where anthropologist Arthur Wolfe spent decades studying a practice called minor marriage, in which families adopted a baby girl and raised her from infancy alongside the boy she was destined to marry, in effect manufacturing a sibling relationship on purpose so the two would grow up under the same roof. Wolfe tracked these marriages against ordinary arranged unions, where the spouses met as adults, and the results lined up almost exactly with Westermarck's prediction. Minor marriages showed far higher divorce rates, lower birth rates, and more reported infidelity than marriages between people who had not grown up together. Once anthropologists understood the Westermarck effect, an old and widespread marriage pattern suddenly made a lot more sense: cross-cousin marriage. In huge stretches of the traditional world, from parts of the Middle East to South Asia to large sections of indigenous Australia, marrying a specific category of cousin wasn't just allowed, it was actively preferred and sometimes expected. That sounds like it should trigger exactly the aversion Westermarck described, until you notice the detail that made it work. Cross-cousins, meaning the children of a mother's brother or a father's sister, typically grew up in separate households, often separate villages, and rarely shared the daily physical closeness of early childhood that produces the Westermarck effect. Families got to keep the alliance entirely inside a trusted, already bonded kin network, reinforcing existing bonds instead of building brand new ones with strangers, while sidestepping the built-in psychological break that would have made a childhood housemate feel wrong as a spouse. It was, without anyone writing it down as a rule, a system precisely tuned to the boundary of an instinct nobody at the time could even name. Here is where your own brain gets pulled into the story, because the aversion Westermarck described and the pull toward attraction sitting right next to it are both still running inside you today, whether or not you've ever lived anywhere close to a kibbutz or a Trobriand village. If hidden wiring like that is the kind of thing you want more of, this channel keeps digging into exactly that, so stick around and subscribe. If negotiated alliances explained who got matched and inherited disgust explained who got ruled out, something else had to explain why humans bond in pairs at all, given that most primates do not. Anthropologist Helen Fisher spent decades researching the biochemistry of human attachment and proposed that pair bonding evolved because human infants are almost uniquely helpless. A newborn chimpanzee can cling to its mother's fur within hours. A human infant cannot even hold up its own head for months and stays dependent on caregivers for close to 2 decades. Fisher argued that this long stretch of dependency created evolutionary pressure for a bonded partner who would stick around long enough to help a single child survive to adulthood, a project measured in years, not seasons. Primatologist Sarah Blaffer Hrdy pushed the idea further, arguing that pair bonding alone was never enough, because raising a human child required more calories and more protection than one mother and one father could realistically provide. Hrdy's research pointed to cooperative breeding, meaning grandmothers, aunts, older siblings, and unrelated group members all pitching in as caregivers, a system she called alloparenting. Marriage, in this framing, was never just 2 adults deciding they liked each other. It was the visible tip of a support structure built out of an entire community, because a mother alone, in a world with hyenas and famine and no hospitals, did not have good odds, and neither did her child. None of this means the specific person mattered nothing. Once a marriage was arranged, biology and psychology still had opinions about who made a good partner within the boundaries kin had already drawn. Psychologist David Buss surveyed more than 10,000 people across 37 cultures in 1989, from Zulu communities in South Africa to city dwellers in Taiwan, asking what people actually looked for in a spouse. Kindness and intelligence ranked at or near the top almost everywhere he looked, a finding that surprised researchers expecting something colder, but clear differences showed up too. Across nearly all 37 cultures, women placed more weight on a partner's resources and status, while men placed more weight on youth and physical signs of fertility, patterns Buss connected to the different reproductive stakes each sex historically faced. Those preferences didn't override the negotiated, alliance-driven system running underneath them. They operated inside it, quietly shaping which candidate within an approved family, an approved clan, or an approved cousin line actually got chosen when there was more than one option on the table. The same evolutionary logic showed up again when Buss turned his attention from preference to jealousy. In a study published in 1992, he asked men and women to imagine two scenarios: a partner falling in love with someone else with no sex involved, and a partner having sex with someone else with no emotional attachment involved, then measured which scenario triggered a stronger physiological stress response. Men across the cultures Buss tested showed a sharper spike in distress at the sexual scenario, consistent with an ancestral problem unique to male reproduction: uncertainty over whether a child was genetically theirs to invest in. Women showed a sharper spike at the emotional scenario, consistent with a different ancestral problem: the risk of a partner diverting resources and long-term commitment toward a rival. Neither reaction required conscious thought or cultural instruction. Both were sitting quietly in the nervous system, shaped by a mating system that had spent hundreds of thousands of years rewarding exactly this kind of vigilance. None of this means ancient humans felt nothing resembling romantic attraction. In 1992, anthropologists William Jankowiak and Edward Fisher examined ethnographic data from 166 cultures around the world and found evidence of romantic love, meaning intense emotional attachment paired with sexual desire for a specific person, in almost 90% of them. The feeling itself is close to universal, wired into human neurochemistry regardless of culture or century. What was not universal, and was actually rare, was the idea that romantic love should be the reason two people marry. In most of the societies Jankowiak and Fisher studied, romantic passion existed alongside marriage, sometimes inside it and often outside it. But it was treated as a separate track from the practical business of forming a household, producing heirs, and binding two families together. You could love someone with your whole chest and still marry whoever your parents had already arranged for you, because those were understood as two different categories of human experience, not one continuous decision. Age adds another layer that modern audiences tend to find uncomfortable. Historical demographic records, compiled by researchers such as historian John Hodgnall, in his influential 1965 study of European marriage patterns, show that outside of Northwestern Europe, women in most traditional societies married and began bearing children shortly after puberty, often in their mid-teens. This was not treated as exploitative within those systems, because it was tied directly to a harsh demographic reality. Life expectancy at birth across most of human history hovered somewhere between 30 and 40 years, dragged down heavily by high infant and child mortality. A woman who wanted a realistic chance of raising several children to adulthood in a world where roughly half of all children died before the age of 5 could not afford to wait. Hodgnall's research also identified something demographers now call the European marriage pattern, a late-marrying, neo-local system that emerged only in parts of northwestern Europe starting around the 1500s, where couples married later, in their mid-20s, and set up entirely new households instead of moving in with either family. That pattern, unusual by world historical standards, is closer to the template most viewers today assume is simply how marriage has always worked. It was not. It was a regional variation running against thousands of years and dozens of cultures' worth of earlier, younger, more kin-controlled precedent. Historian Stephanie Kuntz spent years tracing the written record of marriage across cultures for her 2005 book on the subject, and her conclusion was blunt. The idea that people should marry primarily for love, and that they should have the right to reject a match they did not feel strongly about, only became a dominant social expectation in Western societies within the last 200 to 300 years, and it was treated at the time as dangerous. European commentators in the 1700s worried openly that basing marriage on personal feeling rather than family judgment would destabilize society, because feelings change and property does not. They were not entirely wrong. Divorce rates in societies that adopted love-based marriage climbed steadily once the practice took hold, because a marriage held together by emotion is only as stable as the emotion itself, while a marriage held together by two extended families, shared land, and mutual obligation had far more scaffolding keeping it upright even during the stretches when nobody involved particularly liked each other. None of this is purely ancient history either. Global demographic surveys, including work compiled by researchers at the Pew Research Center and various national statistics agencies, estimate that more than half of all marriages taking place on Earth right now are still arranged to some meaningful degree by family members, rather than freely chosen by the couple alone, concentrated heavily across South Asia, the Middle East, and large parts of Africa. The romantic, self-selected marriage that so much of the world now treats as the only legitimate version is not even close to universal today, let alone across the whole of human history. It is a recent, regional variant layered on top of a much older and far more common system that never actually disappeared. It just went out of fashion in the specific corner of the world that happens to produce most of the movies about weddings. Put all of it together and marriage looks less like something ancient humans stumbled into and more like something they engineered piece by piece out of necessity using tools they didn't know they were building. Kin negotiated alliances because lone families died and connected families survived. Bodies developed an automatic aversion to anyone raised alongside them because inbreeding was a genetic dead end long before anyone understood genetics. Cousin lines learned to marry cousins from other households because it threaded the needle between that aversion and the pull of keeping resources inside trusted kin. Some communities spread paternity itself across several men because one provider was never a guarantee against a bad hunting season. Pair bonds formed because a human child takes almost 20 years to become self-sufficient, and nobody could carry that weight alone. Entire communities absorbed part of the caregiving burden because even two parents were not enough. Romantic love existed the whole time, real and intense, and neurologically close to what you feel today, running underneath a system that was never actually built around it. Choice, in the sense you probably assume when you picture your own wedding day, is one of the newest and least tested features marriage has ever had. Everything else about it was field-tested for a few 100,000 years first. A question worth sitting with before you go. If you had been born into almost any society before the last few centuries, the person you married would likely have been chosen for you by people thinking about survival, alliance, and obligation long before they thought about how you'd feel about it, and by instincts running underneath your own awareness that you never gave permission to install. The attraction, the jealousy, the aversion to anyone who ever felt like a sibling, none of it was ever fully yours to begin with. It was inherited machinery, tuned across hundreds of thousands of years by people who never once heard the word love used as a reason to marry anyone. Subscribe if this kind of hidden history is your thing, and let me know in the comments whether you think you would have made a better call than your grandparents' grandparents did.